Shall we start?
Yes.
Thank you all for being here this morning. So we start with our first panel this morning on orality, literature and history. And our first speaker is Sadna Naithani from JNU, and she will speak on the late pandit to William Crook.
Thank you, Parimalajan. And yeah, my paper today is titled CHRT, The Late Pandit to William Crook. A comparative study involves two or more different subjects. These subjects may be texts, people, or phenomena. But they are two separate entities in the sense that their existence is independent of each other. I am concerned here with a situation which is essentially different from this form of comparativism. I am discussing a situation where two individuals are involved in the creation of a single text. I am asking, is it possible to apply comparativism here? And how is it possible to apply comparativism here when they created one single text? This situation challenges the very basis of comparativism, and more importantly, this is the quintessential situation in the production of cultural anthropological texts in the colonial context. Here the two different individuals are merged into one text, but this singularity of the text is an illusion. This illusion deludes us into forgetting the plurality in the authorship of this text. Edward Said tried to break through this illusion by dissecting the ideological paradigm of the so-called Orientalist texts, which led to an unprecedented critique of the Orientalists, that is, the European authors of the Orientalist texts. The singularity of the author and the text, however, remained, and is perhaps justified at the level of philological texts like the ones produced by German Indologists. I am concerned with cultural anthropological texts, where the single texts were based on orality and were created in a process whereby the European author could not create the text without the help, assistance, or collaboration of the famous native assistant. More specifically, I am talking of the collection, translation, and textualization of oral literary texts in the British Empire, and particularly of the work of William Crook, 1848 to 1923, and Ram Garib Chaube, whose date of birth we do not know, but who died in 1914. On the Indian subcontinent, collection of folklore became a passion, followed by British missionaries, Mem Sahibs, and the administrator scholars after 1857. It was believed to reveal the mind of the people. The question is, how were these texts compiled? These oral texts existed in vernacular, in dialects that is. The British officers were at best trained in classical languages, Persian, Sanskrit, so how did they collect the oral literature? We are aware of the concept of the native assistant, who was generally an office clerk with functional knowledge of English and able to establish communication between narrators and the British collector. This person has generally been seen as an informant, and as the concept suggests, the person has been imagined as someone who supplied information, not knowledge. The singular author of the published text, as also of the reader's imagination, has been the British individual. The native assistant or informant faded into insignificance because his role in the making of the text remained unspecified. The personality of the so-called native assistant became fully crystallized when I tracked down the unpublished collection of the folk tales of northern India by William Crook. The collection was so famous that it was almost assumed to be there in publication. In 1996, I opened an uncatalogued box of manuscripts in the archives of the Folklore Society, London. Years of research following that moment showed that this box was closed in 1886, that is, 100 years ago, in Mirzapur, most likely by the person who had signed the English manuscripts written in a neat cursive handwriting, Pandit Ram Garib Chaube. Rather obviously, the manuscripts of 150 stories of varying lengths were written by this man. On reading them, three more things became clear. One, they were translations from various dialects of Hindi language from across the region, then called United Provinces and today called Uttar Pradesh. Two, the writer of the manuscripts was knowledgeable about anthropological categories and principles of folktale collection. So he was obviously not just a clerk. And three, that William Crook had given an English title to almost every story. On typing the manuscripts into the Word program and clicking on British English as the language option, it became clear that the manuscripts were in grammatically perfect English language. But the flavor of the Indian vernacular had been maintained in a variety of conscious ways. As someone trained in European folkloristics, I could see that methodologically the textualization was far ahead of internationally prevalent principles. In short, it was evident that the text was produced through the collaboration of William Crook and Ram Garib Chaube, but the latter, that is Chaube, was the creator of the English language texts, that is the manuscripts. Chaube was, however, not to be found in any catalogue. It took several years to piece together the story of this collaboration, a research published as a book long ago. Today I wish to return to this subject with reference to comparativism. How can we compare Crook and Chaube, who created texts in which they were both invested? An Edward Sayidian method of analysis is far too inadequate to understand this collaboration, because the colonizer and colonized are not too far away points on a bipolar scale, but entwined through intention, history, and geography. I am going to present a comparative analysis of William Crook and Ram Garib Chaube based on three levels. One, their perception of the place they were in, which means the towns, villages, and official complexes around which their lives revolved. Two, the trajectories of their individual lives. And three, their mark on the single text of the tales. I must add that this is a very big story, and I am only able to give you fragments within the time that I have, and I plan to stay within that time. One, perception of the place. Ram Garib Chaube and William Crook met in Mirzapur. In 1890 or 1891. As an ICS officer, Crook was the district magistrate and revenue collector, and Chaube was the graduate of the Presidency College, Calcutta. Currently residing with his friends, the Sadar Kanungo, which is a high official in the local court of the town. This Sadar Kanungo was also a very knowledgeable person in Persian language. He hailed from a village in the nearby Gorakhpur district, that is Chaube, but had done his BA from Calcutta, the then capital of the British Empire in India. He was back in his home province trying to live a life of a free scholar. When he met Crook, there started an intellectual journey, which both had perhaps desired but had no experience of. The aim was collection of folk tales, but the process involved discussions, traveling through the countryside, gathering texts in vernacular, and translating and finalizing them. For Crook, Mirzapur was a Mufassil town, surrounded by tribal populace, but a rich ground for his anthropological dreams to find expression. He even considered his duty hours as the magistrate in the local courts to be anthropological field for collection of data. The petitioners in his court said and believed things that were important source of information. For Chaube, on the other hand, Mirzapur was a town where several of his friends who were then thinking and working towards development of Hindi language, the Hindi Pracharani Sabha, were stationed. He had found an intellectual context there to share and grow his education. His friend circle was comprised of educated and literary oriented peers. And if I may add here, he was staying in the house of the Sadar Kanungo and being the English language teacher to his son, and the son was none other than Ramchandra Shukla, who wrote the history of Hindi literature for the first time later on. So that's the man we are talking about. In all probability, these people, Chobe and his friends, saw themselves as different from the rural and illiterate folk. But they were very closed and very local scholars, not distanced by class. So the same place, a small town called Mirzapur, was very different in the perception of the two men. Accordingly, the meaning of their association with each other too differed in their perceptions. For Chobe, collaborating with Crook was a process of communicating local knowledge to the big, wide world. For Crook, collaborating with Chobe was the key to accessing knowledge that was otherwise inaccessible for him in spite of his presence in this part of the world. Seen from our perspective, or rather postmodern perspective, it was a process of internationalizing for both of them. While Crook hoped to enter the narrative nooks and corners of India, Chobe envisioned reaching out to Europe. This is what Argentinian scholar Walter Di Mignolo describes as local histories / global designs. In his book of the same title, Local Histories / Global Designs, he argues that colonialism modernized not only the colonized, but the colonizer as well. Both were provincial before the colonial encounter. In the case of Chobe and Crook, their interaction proved transformative for both, as can be seen in the trajectories of their lives. So my second level of analysis, the trajectories of their individual lives. Living in the same place still meant very different trajectories of life for them. Chobe had come from a village and a poor family. Crook was an ICS officer, the most powerful bureaucracy in the world then and now, and came from a well-off Anglo-Irish family. It was Chobe's perception of the location of knowledge in the oral narratives of rural women, like his grandmother, that let him take up Crook's project with enthusiasm and passion. So while Crook utilized the cooperation of his civil servant friends to send a circular to all village school teachers to send folk tales, Chobe immersed in them with intensity to translate those texts into English language. During the tours of the countryside, while Crook neglected his wife and sat under trees listening to stories, Chobe noted down the stories to translate later and presumably communicated also with the narrators. Evidently, Chobe loved his habitat and thought he was engaged in the process of communicating its culture to the world. Crook too was engaged in communicating knowledge about a primitive culture to the advanced West. The common elements in their perceptions were intensity of engagement and growth of mutual respect. Chobe was impressed with Crook's engagement in understanding his world, Chobe's world, and Crook was impressed with the unusual abilities of Chobe. By one account, he was mesmerized by Chobe's multilinguality and knowledge. In the process of collection of folklore, Chobe became obsessive about communicating the culture of his land to the world through Crook. Crook, on the other hand, became a critic of the Secretariat and Orientalist scholarship. He realized that knowledge about India's society and culture was not in the high-flown works of the Orientalists, but in the narratives and beliefs of India's populace in the rural areas. He realized the difference between the vernacular and official religions. These realizations made him see the flaws in the British administration of India, and he became increasingly distanced from the powers that were. At the end of a 4-year collaboration with Chobe, Crook resigned from the ICS and in 1896 went back to England. Chobe could not distance himself from creating knowledge about his society, but found that the knowledge produced could not reach its goal without Crook. He had produced knowledge that was meant for publication in England and hardly had any local market. He worked for Grierson too, but it was not as satisfying as work with Crook. Crook's departure also meant that his earnings as the associate came to an end. He returned to his village, penniless and obsessive. Thus, when he received a letter from Crook in 1890, 4 years after his departure, presumably asking for some ethnographic data, because we don't have this letter, he replied in a 50-page letter, firstly reminiscing about their collaborative work and the moments connected with it, and then providing the ethnographic data in as organized and scientific a manner as he had done earlier. This letter is an expression of this colonial relationship from Chaube's point of view. He was clearly aware how history will relegate him to insignificance, of not having been acknowledged for his contribution, and without complaining, set the record straight. His reminiscing the time spent with Crook shows how different Crook was from other civil servants, how compassionate and respectful towards Chaube. It also shows why Chaube continued to work without acknowledgement, and in a master stroke of verbal expression reveals how he defined his relationship to Crook. At the end of the letter, having shared with Crook his miserable condition, he says, quotes open, "But whenever I write for the Journal of the Asiatic Society, I always subscribe myself as late Pandit to William Crook, Esquire." Quotes close. The formulation Pandit to, and Crook knew enough Hindi for that, Pandit to implies the relationship of teacher and student, and that's how he signed the letter, while simultaneously referring to Crook as Your Honor, Your Worship, etc. In this simultaneity are hidden the complexities that are crucial to our comparative understanding of Crook and Chaube. Their relationship was at two levels of existence. One was a relationship of knowledge, and the other a social relationship. In the former, Chaube was the teacher, and in the latter, he was an assistant to a British gentleman. William Crook published several books until his death in 1923, but not the manuscripts of folk tales signed by Chaube. He left them very safe in the archive of the Folklore Society, but without a note of explanation. He archived Chaube's letter in his personal papers. Chaube's obsessive state grew into insanity, and he died as such in 1914 in his village. By all accounts, towards the end of their lives, both were emotionally broken men, although for apparently different reasons. How can these two individuals be compared with each other? They are two separate entities, but their existence is defined by each other. Without Chaube, there would not have been the Crook we know as administrator scholar. Without Crook, Chaube could not have produced a folktale collection of international standard. And yet, their lives are so different from each other. In a way, this is an allegory of the relationship between the nations that colonized and those that were colonized. The center-periphery and colonizer-colonized dichotomies do not acknowledge that both changed in the process. Anyhow, returning to Crook and Chaube, I shall now move to the third level of my comparative analysis, the text produced by them together. Their marks on the single text of the tales. The biggest collection of folk tales compiled in colonial India was that of Chaube and Crook. The finest part of the collection remained unpublished. Some were published in Indian antiquity. Tied in a file of the Revenue Code and kept uncatalogued in the archive of the Folklore Society, London. These tales, now published, represent various genres. The manuscripts have a systematic order. Names of the narrators and place of narration on top. Then the text with margin notes and footnotes by Chaube. His signature at the end of most of them. And on the left corner of the first page, a title and sometimes a comment in Crook's handwriting. Chaube's notes give the impression that he was inserting his identity in the margins, as if he was aware of the anonymity that would be his fate. These notes reveal that he was someone knowledgeable about scientific practices. For example, he tells us why he has chosen one particular version out of many variants of a tale. He explains terms, particularly those for which an exact translation is missing, like Dharma Shastra. He provides information on cultural practices or rituals that are just mentioned by name in the story. His translations are both literal and adaptive. In short, he is aware that he is communicating across cultural and linguistic borders and realizes the need to explain while narrating a story. These texts by Chaube are not simple translations, but original texts in their composition and art of storytelling. The stamp of the times and of the context is very much there. Crook is also present in the titles he gives to the stories. For example, to a tale about a man promising a pound of his flesh if he loses a game, and the Qazi solving a matter later on, Crook titles it Shylock, clearly referring to William Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice. In another similar tale, the reference comes more clearly and Crook adds the comment, quotes, "Is this an importation," that's about a tale, "is this an importation from The Merchant of Venice or an oriental version of the same tale?" Quotes close. In titling yet another tale, Crook gives two titles, The Pig Prince and brackets, Beauty and the Beast, quote close. The first title is derived from the tale, while the second gives its comparative version in the European folk tale. At another point, he evaluates the tale, quotes, "The boy in search of chastity," brackets, "not bad," quotes close. Crook too is traversing the two worlds, that of India and Europe. On the one hand, his titles reflect his understanding of the Indian tale, and on the other, he establishes the comparison with European tales. The texts of the tales show marks of Crook and Chaube. These different marks, however, reveal the interdependence of each and a dialogue with the other. None of the two seems to be complete in himself, and both are traversing two worlds. This is what I have elsewhere called colonial disjunctions. Both have become so aware of the identity of another reality that the relationship with one's own reality has become fractured or distanced. This similarity is not really a similarity, as the relationship of the two to the two worlds they traverse is very different. For Chaube, Europe is an imaginary space. For Crook, India is a place of residence, of work, and of experiencing power. Although we know from Chaube the respect Crook accorded to him, and the manuscripts in his handwriting are an evidence of the space he had for self-expression, yet the power relations between them were not lost to him. Chaube's sense of his own place in history is remarkable, as it is evidenced in his self-identification as late Pandit to William Crook. This sensitivity and the accompanying pain comes across in a story too. In fact, the only story, as I said on the top, it says recorded by, told by, etc. But there is only one story in this huge collection where it says told and recorded by Ram Garib Chaube. I mean, just imagine, he's recording himself. This one story you must hear before you ponder on the uniqueness of this comparative situation, where the lives of two authors are entwined and yet separate. So with the permission of the chair, I'll just take 1.5 minutes more and tell you this little story that reveals something about Chaube. This is that book which contains In Quest of Indian Folktales. This is an American edition. There's also an Indian edition of this. There was once a certain king who had a wise and able vizier. It so happened after some time that the vizier resigned the service and he took himself to the worship of God. When the king next morning did not find the vizier in his court, he asked the courtiers what had become of his able vizier. They told him that he had resigned the service and taken to the service of God. The king then summoned the vizier and asked him why he resigned his service and took to the service of God. The vizier replied that he did so on account of 5 reasons, namely, 1. When I am in thy service, thou art sitting and I am standing, but in the service of God I am allowed to sit. 2. Thou takest meal and I have only to look at it, but God gives us food and never takes food himself. 3. Thou sleepest and I have to guard thee. I have to guard thee as a sentinel, but in the service of God I sleep, and God keeps an eye on me. 4. If thou diest, I shall be troubled by my enemies. But God never dies, and so I have no fear of being troubled by my enemies if I am a servant of God. 5. I am always in fear that if I commit a wrong against thee, thou shalt punish me. But if I commit a wrong against God, I'm sure He will pardon me if I sincerely implore forgiveness from Him. Thank you for your attention.
Very much. After that, our next speaker is Badri Narayan from GPP Institute in Allahabad, and he's going to talk about emotions, curse, and criticism, Bihari Thakur in Bhojpuri oral and cultural space. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I am very thankful to Francesca and Puru for inviting me to share some of my research on this topic. Actually, emotion and criticism is usually put as binary. But here I am proposing how emotion is used for criticism and emotion produced as a curse and curse as a technique for criticism in Bhojpuri oral literature, and that is and I am going to discuss especially Bihari Thakur in this Bhojpuri oral space. Actually, you know about Bhojpuri region from Mirzapur to Bihar, from Nepal and Western Bihar and this Eastern UP, and also Tharu area of Nepal, and now Suriname, Mauritius, Trinidad, Guyana. It's a big Bhojpuri diaspora has developed. So Bhojpuri is a largely spoken by a big population, more than 20 crores. This is one of the calculation. I don't know if it's true or not, but there is data. There's a 20 crore people that speaks Bhojpuri. And here I'm going to talk about which happened in Bhojpuri region, that is the migration. And migration is happen everywhere, and everywhere it produces literature. But in Bhojpuri region, there are three traditions in oral literature. There are three traditions which reflects the migration, and migration is happening in oral space. One is in Bhojpuri there is one tradition that is called Videsiya tradition, and Videsiya tradition means the migrant who disappeared, who migrated to another land, from about whom there is no news, no message, nothing, no information. There is another tradition that is called Pardesiya tradition. Pardesiya means Pardesiya who migrated, but he used to come, he writes later, he keeps in touch with the family. He comes in Holi, Diwali and dukh jaga ke chala jata hai, no? He evokes pain and then he goes again. So that kind this Pardesiya tradition. And then Batohiya tradition. Batohiya means now they are coming back to see their land, and they are developing a new relation as Batohiya, as a trespasser or as a traveler or whatever. So these three metaphors you can find always recurs in Bhojpuri oral songs, oral stories, oral traditions. There are overlap between three, but there are clear distinction between Videsiya and Pardesiya. But but Videsiya and Pardesiya also became overlap somewhere. I'll tell you while analyzing these traditions. So you know the Videsiya term. First of all is not good way to see the everything. But in Kabir poetry, Videsiya terms appear. But that Videsiya may be the An Muluk, means the another land, and another land maybe land of mystery, maybe Agampur or maybe Maya Bajar or maybe whatever. Sorry, Agampur or every poet has its own land, and that An Muluk may be that kind of land. But the another poet of Kabirpanthi tradition in Bhojpuri region, Keshav Das, he used this term in 1850. Videsiya term in his poetry. And there he also talks about that Sajan went Pardes, Sajan went Vides, how I can live without him. This kind of expression he composed in his poem. And then after 1850, there is another poet emerged. He was a king, prince of Gorakhpur, Maharaja Khadak Bahadur Mal, and he composed a poem in which he described Vides as one of the metaphor, and Videsiya as one of the metaphor. And then there are a lot of poets emerged in Bhojpuri region, those who use this in the period when this indentured migration was taking place from the Bhojpuri region. Indentured migration, as you know, the because of this colonial intervention, more than 1.2 million people migrated from the same land, and they migrated as indentured laborers. And this was the time when this migration was going on, and these metaphors was coming in Bhojpuri oral poetry. So another poet of Buxar is a place near Ara. His name was Ram Shakal Pathak Divjram. He composed a song, and in the same Videsiya meter. And in this Videsiya, everything ends with Videsiya. Oh Videsiya, why you left me, oh Videsiya? You know, that kind of expression you can find the same meter of Videsiya, and the take is also Videsiya. So he composed that this Videsiya song, and then in 90 there is a whole tradition. I want to propose that Videsiya is not a genre or repertoire of a one person. It is a tradition which emerged in the Bhojpuri oral traditions, and various poets use these metaphors and compose songs, volumes of songs written by one of the poets of Gorakhpur, and in the Videsiya meter, and that Videsiya expressed the entire migration pathos and pain and suffering caused by this indentured migration. Then Bhikhari Thakur came in 1912, and he composed a musical theatre based on this Videsiya meter. And this Videsiya meter, like this गवना कराई पिया घरे बैठवले से अपने गईले परदेसरे विदेशिया. Married me and left me in the home, and you left Videsh, oh Videsiya. So various kinds of the whole process of migration you can find in this Videsiya song. And Videsiya theatre which Bhikhari Thakur composed, lakhs of people comes to see that Videsiya theatre during that period, 1912, 1917, 1920, and that was very famous, popular theatre form of Bhojpuri region, and also song tradition. In this theatre, there is a story of a person who went from the village to Calcutta, and then he left his wife and the family. The whole story tells about this migration. But what is added in this story is the story of disappearance, because people used to go to Calcutta and then they disappear, because Calcutta was a port, and from there they used to take to Suriname, Mauritius, Trinidad, and they used to tell that no, we are not going to take you so far. It's very near to Calcutta. It's a Ganga Sagar, and every month ship will come and you will come back and you can go very easy. So the story is that they elude people from here to go to a distant land. So I'm not going to tell you about this migration, the history of the migration, but the literary and creative history of migration I'm going to tell you. And this Videsiya meter is not only in Bhojpuri region, it's also popular in Suriname, in Trinidad, in Guyana, and this is in the Sawal Jawab form. Like here people raise question, why you left us? Ka kaili chukwa tu chodala mulukwa tu. Ab kahla na dilwa ke haliya balamua. And what mistake I committed that you left me and you left this land? Then the people reply from the Suriname side, why we left? And they gave the whole story that Palake Jahajwa mein Rohit Hui Baithili se, what was the cause for this migration? Their compulsion, they used to tell in that. Garibi tha, poverty thi, we were, various kinds of causes. It's a kind of coming out from the guilt. Here, this emotion created by the Videsiya tradition create a curse against colonialism, against those who took them away. Like there is a song, Relia na bairi jhajiya na bairi se, this Relia bairi piya ke liye jaye re. Relia bairi, Reli is my enemy who is taking away my husband. And curse is, Jaune tikaswa se piya more jayi hai, tikas jale टिकस जली जाए रे जौने सहरवा में पिया मोरे जई हैं बिजली गिरे शहर जली जाए रे that शहर should destroy Calcutta should go away. No, there is a lot of curse against Calcutta because Calcutta is metaphor. In every song, the Piya Gaile Calcutta Ware Sajani, Chole Pati Patni ke Natware Sajani. There are a lot of criticism against Calcutta. All actually Calcutta is a metaphor who took all the curse against colonialism. So that's the pathos of Calcutta because Calcutta is in India. But it took all the Bhojpuri criticism against colonialism is through Calcutta. So emotion caused by this separation because of the migration converted in the curse in literary production, and that curse proposed as a criticism, and the one metaphor was Calcutta, Kala Pani Calcutta. So this Sawal Jawab form is very interesting, in which the people from diaspora respond in the same Videsia meter. So Videsia became a kind of representative of narrating the colonial experience of the migration. And you know, this is a very different kind of disappearance. People were not knowing who went where. And we were interviewing in a village, and there was a two-person, they were the Chamar caste person. And in the Suriname archive, there is mentioned that they came from this village of Sultanpur, near Sultanpur, and they developed their family here. They worked here in this plantation and all. So we went in that village, and we were taking interview of the people about the memory of that person. They said कि एक बार बहुत तेज आंधी आई थी और वो लोग आंधी में उड़ गए, पता नहीं कहाँ चले गए. No, they had no clue that they migrated. So it's a kind of very magical realism of this migration story, that we don't know where they disappeared, and their wife died while crying, because this 1.2 million people who migrated, in that most of them were male and very few were female, and most of the female left out here. And so this Videsia tradition represent this story of the deserted women, and deserted women, this emotion of this deserted life converts in a curse, and curse is a criticism. Curse is always considered as a weapon of the weak, but here curse I propose is not the weapon of the weak. It's a curse is a weapon of the collective who criticize colonialism. Is a very powerful criticism of colonialism, which you can't find in literary tradition, in a written literary tradition. That kind of curse, the kind of curse which they created in the oral traditions. So oral method of critiquing colonialism is you can find in this kind of traditions, and Bhikhari Thakur represented that tradition. So Bhikhari Thakur was a kind of also a metaphor. He was a person but a metaphor who reflected this creative history of this migration history of the society, history of the suffering of the society, and he gave it the voice. And you know, before Bhikhari Thakur there was no dance tradition in Bhojpuri region. We had only Gond dance tradition, Gond Nach of the Gond caste is a very and first of all Bhikhari Thakur gave a dance tradition, means Nach. Dance is not the right translation of the Nach. Nach of tradition to Bhojpuri region, and it's a kind of identity also. So Gond Nach to Videsia Nach, because he took many things from the Gond Nach and used them in this kind of literary production. And he criticized not only the metaphors of the migration, but also the process and the state. Like there is a very interesting story which appears in this one of the drama, that one person was going, and some looters, dacoits, came and they looted that person. That person went to the Thana, and this is a story of 1970, and he was reporting his story, that it happens with me. And the Thanedar was writing that story with the same golden pen which was with that person. And that story of 1920, when Bhikhari Thakur was composing this story. In this another tradition emerged in Bhojpuri region, and that is Batohiya tradition. One of the poets of the Bhojpuri region, Babu Raghubir Narayan Singh, he composed Videsi Batohiya song. And when Batohiya song, Sundar Subhumi Bhaiya Bharat ke desava se mor pran base himko hai re Batohiya. And in that song, he said Bharat was so beautiful, it was a glorious tradition, but you left that Bharat. So come and see that Bharat. So come at Batohiya and see that Bharat. So that appeal he did in 1920 when indentured migration was being stopped. In 1917, indentured migration abolished, and then these people from Bhojpuri region appealed to their own people who migrated from this land that you come at Batohiya. And you know, Mauritius started coming and even started marrying here with their boys and girls in that 1922, 1923. So that kind of relation started. So it's very organic. Even with Mauritius, it's an organic relationship. But with Suriname, it's very pathetic because many people died while thinking that they will be back India sometime. And they couldn't save money so that they can come back. There is another poet emerged in Bhojpuri region. I'm not going to focus a lot on Bihari Thakur because he wrote many voluminous theatres and dramas and the songs, and it will take a long time to describe the entire his compositions. But I'll put it in this discourse another poet of the Bhojpuri region who also represented this colonial experience of migration, and his name was Mahendra Mishra. And Mahendra Misir and Bihari Thakur were the poet of the country at the same time, and they had a kind of real interaction also. Bihari Thakur used to go to Mahendra Mishra was a jamindar, and Bihari Thakur was a laborer. It's a kind of laborer. He migrated from Chhapra to Calcutta. He worked there. Nautanki mein kaam kiya, kirtan banaya, and he did many things there in Calcutta. Then he returned back in the Chhapra and he formed this Nach party and this. So Mahendra Misir, there's the comparison between Mahendra Misir and the Bihari Thakur is that in Mahendra Misir's songs you can find very fine poetic metaphors, and very sensuous, sometimes very sensuous, like Manguli mein katli biya naginiya re सैया बैदा को बुला दो या छुड़ी लेके यहाँ नेपाल से. If you come from Nepal, you bring bangles for me. But in Bihari Thakur composition, you can find a lot of subalternity of experience, subaltern experience you can find in its constructions, in composition. That's another form of debate and a discussion about the experience has its own subalternity also. And that kind of thing maybe we can discuss sometime. So here I'm going to stop because of the I summarize that Videsiya tradition is a collective tradition which represents migration pathos and suffering, and it is not construction of one person, it's the construction of entire collective, but it was represented by many poets at different time, and they gave different meaning to term Videsiya, and Videsiya is one meaning given by this person Bihari Thakur, and there is another meaning given by Mahendra Mishra, and the many poets of that land gave different meanings to that. And the poet of Trinidad and the poet of Suriname, the singers and poets, they composed their songs in terms of Sawal and Jawab, in Sawal Jawab form, and they gave their own editions in this form, lyric, tune, and content also, and it both together composed a history of the experience of the colonial migration through literature and through oral literature. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Very interesting. Our next speaker is Khalid Zikri from the University of Meknes in Morocco, and he will talk about writing orality in colonial context.
concerne l'oralité dans les littératures du monde arabe. Et je vais parler de l'Orient, notamment de l'Égypte, mais je vais parler aussi du Maghreb, notamment d'un écrivain tunisien et d'un écrivain marocain. Alors, le problème qui s'était posé aux écrivains du monde arabe, c'est comment écrire un roman sans tomber dans l'imitation aveugle du genre tel qu'il a évolué dans le monde occidental, c'est-à-dire tel qu'il a évolué dans l'empire colonial. Et donc ce défi auquel les écrivains étaient confrontés, ils ont essayé d'y répondre, de trouver des réponses avec des moyens à la fois thématiques et formels. Je vais prendre, la question de l'oralité est très complexe, je vais prendre deux exemples concrets pour expliquer comment l'oralité se déploie dans la littérature. Premier exemple, c'est la manière dont le roman maghrébin et arabe en général a introduit ce qu'on appelle la maqama. Le maqama, qui est un genre littéraire arabe dans lequel il y a un personnage central qui est généralement un aventurier qui cherche à vivre, à s'en sortir par la ruse et par l'éloquence, c'est-à-dire par le discours. Et ce personnage-là, dans ce roman, il transmet les histoires oralement. Donc la maqama, c'est un genre dans lequel l'oralité est très présente. Alors le premier qui a utilisé ça dans le roman moderne, il s'appelle Muhammad al-Muwaylihi. C'est un Égyptien de la fin du 19e siècle, début 20e siècle, c'est-à-dire l'époque à laquelle l'Égypte était sous mandat britannique et c'était la fin vraiment de l'Empire ottoman. Dans ce roman assez intéressant qui s'appelle Hadith Isa ibn Hisham ou Fatra min az-Zaman, Hadith Isa ibn Hisham qu'on peut traduire par ce que Isa ibn Hisham nous conta. Alors il y a deux choses à évoquer dans ce texte. D'abord, hadith qui vient de la tradition prophétique, c'est-à-dire l'ensemble des textes dans lesquels les paroles et les actes du prophète sont racontés, donc c'est ce qu'on appelle le hadith. Et puis le personnage Ibn Hisham qui transmet justement les hadiths. Il y a un livre qui a été compilé dans lequel il y avait les paroles et les actes du prophète, et c'est Ibn Hisham qui a collecté ces hadiths. Ça, c'est la première référence, donc qui est islamique. Et la deuxième référence, c'est celle justement de la maqama, c'est-à-dire ce qu'on traduit en français par la séance, c'est-à-dire ce genre littéraire arabe classique qui est né vers la fin du Xe siècle, c'est-à-dire au Moyen-Âge arabe. Et il y a un auteur qui a inventé ce genre-là, qui s'appelle Al-Hamadani, et celui qui est venu après lui s'appelle Al-Hariri. Donc, Al-Muwaylihi, fin 19e siècle, début 20e siècle, va revenir à la tradition médiévale arabe et va prendre dans cette tradition la maqama parce qu'elle a cette spécificité d'abord de transmettre, donc le désir de vouloir se détacher du roman tel qu'il s'écrit dans le monde occidental et de tisser un lien de mémoire avec la culture arabo-islamique classique. C'est-à-dire, on revient à une question qui est à la fois historique mais aussi quelque part psychanalytique, c'est la position du sujet. C'est-à-dire comment un écrivain arabe sous le colonialisme essaye de se positionner comme un sujet autonome écrivant qui invente le genre du roman avec un lien avec son histoire ancienne. Donc, la question du sujet est ici une question d'historicité. Comment garder ce lien avec l'histoire traditionnelle tout en s'ouvrant sur le genre littéraire arabe, français en qui est un genre importé par la littérature coloniale. Donc, ça c'est sur le plan de la forme même de l'écriture. Al-Muwaylihi va avoir ce génie d'inventer une nouvelle forme qui n'est ni le roman ni la maqama et qu'on pourrait appeler le roman maqama avec un trait d'union entre les deux. Donc, ce qui me semble intéressant ici, c'est que Al-Muwaylihi n'oublie pas qu'il s'inscrit en tant qu'écrivain dans une longue histoire littéraire et que le conflit avec le genre romanesque importé par le monde colonial ne se pose pas au fond ici. C'est une question de négociation générique. On n'est pas ici dans un binarisme entre roman colonial et tradition arabo-islamique, mais on est dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler une négociation, c'est-à-dire une politique de la relation entre le genre romanesque et la tradition arabo-islamique. Ce qui a donné lieu à ce tierce espace que j'appellerais le genre roman maqama chez Al-Muwaylihi. Et il ne faut pas oublier que c'est la naissance du roman qui est en jeu également ici. C'est-à-dire, sur le plan de l'histoire, on peut le classer comme le roman qui a donné les premiers germes de l'écriture romanesque arabe. C'est un débat assez long sur est-ce que c'est le premier roman ou non, mais ce n'est pas un débat important puisqu'il n'y a pas d'origine, à vrai dire, et que les écrivains eux-mêmes arabes essayent de ne pas tomber dans le piège de l'origine, qui est généralement un piège mortifère, car l'origine pose un vrai problème au niveau de la position du sujet. Beaucoup plus tard, un autre écrivain, cette fois-ci tunisien, qui s'appelle Mahmoud al-Msa'di, va revenir à cette question de la maqama et va écrire le roman en s'inspirant directement, là encore, de la maqama. Rappelez-vous le titre d'Al-Muwaylihi, Hadith Isa ibn Hisham. Le titre de Al-Msa'di, ça va être Haddathana Isa ibn Hisham. Au lieu d'utiliser hadith, qui est dans la tradition islamique, il va utiliser le verbe haddatha, c'est-à-dire il nous a raconté. Et nous sommes là à la fois dans la narration, qui est aussi l'espace du roman et l'espace de la maqama, et il va changer Isa ibn Hisham par Abu Hurayra. Haddathana Abu Hurayra qal. Abu Hurayra, c'est un personnage qu'on trouve dans les hadiths, c'est-à-dire dans la tradition prophétique qui raconte la biographie, le bios prophétique. Et ce personnage, Ibn Hurayra, c'est un transmetteur. C'est quelqu'un qui transmet les paroles et les actes du prophète. Donc vous voyez, il y a un travail de substitution. Al-Msa'di, c'est un écrivain qui était élevé sous le colonialisme, mais qui a quand même vécu une période après le colonialisme. Et il écrit en langue arabe. Et Abu Hurayra, il vient de la tradition du prophète, et haddatha, c'est la transformation du hadith. Donc, nous passons de la passivité du mot vers l'activité du verbe. Déjà là, l'écrivain essaye de créer un genre actif qui n'est pas un genre passif. Et quand on dit haddatha, on s'approprie la parole et on produit un discours sur soi. C'est une décolonisation du sujet écrivain arabe. C'est-à-dire, dans la tradition littéraire coloniale, en tout cas francophone essentiellement, généralement, l'indigène ne prend pas la parole. Généralement. Par exemple, un auteur comme l'auteur d'Asiadé, Pierre Loti, eh bien, il raconte ce qui se passe dans les espaces exotiques, mais il ne donne pas la parole aux indigènes. Ne pas donner la parole aux indigènes, c'est les mettre dans une situation de subalternité qui leur enlève le canal de transmission de la parole, c'est-à-dire qui leur enlève la possibilité de devenir un sujet politique qui se positionne dans l'espace public. Ce qui veut dire que Al-Msa'di, en accordant la parole à un subalterne, il accorde en même temps un canal politique à ce subalterne. Et par conséquent, littérature et politique n'est plus une question d'engagement au sens partisan, engagement dans un parti, mais c'est une question de parole. Comment faire de la parole littéraire un acte de positionnement politique dans un contexte colonial qui, en principe, efface de la visibilité sociale toute présence indigène. Et c'est quelque chose de très intéressant par rapport à la création même du genre romanesque arabe. Le genre romanesque, c'est un genre qui, en principe, pose des tensions. C'est le genre dans lequel les tensions sont les plus visibles. J'ai un collègue suisse qui a travaillé sur les questions de tension, et c'est très intéressant ce qu'il a fait comme travail. D'ailleurs, son livre s'appelle « Tension narrative », et il explique comment le roman est le lieu par excellence de la mise en scène des tensions. Et ces tensions ne sont pas forcément négatives, elles sont aussi productives parce qu'elles donnent lieu à une parole qui, en principe, dans l'espace social, c'est-à-dire dans le monde des expériences, a du mal à se positionner. Et je trouve que c'est très intéressant de voir comment le Sadi donne la parole à ce personnage subalterne pour justement le sortir de la sphère invisible et le faire entrer dans la visibilité que lui refuse l'espace colonial. D'ailleurs, non seulement il le sort de l'invisibilité coloniale, mais il prend ses distances aussi par rapport à la tradition, c'est-à-dire qu'il ne veut tomber ni dans le mimétisme colonial, ni dans le mimétisme de la tradition. Il veut inventer un nouvel espace, ce qu'on pourrait appeler un tiers-espace, qui est au fond le fruit de la négociation entre tensions modernes et tensions traditionnelles. Et là, il nous dit de manière explicite dans son texte, je vais citer son texte, d'après un récit, les Abi Huraira sont trois. Il y a trois types d'Abi Huraira. Il nous dit, le premier, c'est le compagnon du prophète, que Dieu le bénisse. Donc le premier, il est dans la tradition religieuse. Le deuxième, c'est un grammairien, donc il est dans la langue. Et le troisième, c'est le mien, c'est celui que je mets dans le roman. C'est-à-dire, le troisième espace, the third space, le tiers espace, n'est ni celui du prophète, ni celui du grammairien, mais celui du romancier profane, c'est-à-dire de l'homme nouveau, et le mot homme nouveau existe dans le texte de Sadi, c'est l'homme nouveau qu'on veut inventer à l'intersection du colonial et du postcolonial. L'homme nouveau n'est ni celui qui est emprisonné dans le nationalisme mortifère, ni celui qui est emprisonné dans le colonialisme mimétique, mais c'est un homme à inventer, c'est-à-dire, d'une manière métaphorique, c'est la métaphore de la communauté à venir. C'est-à-dire, cette communauté que le roman essaye de créer à partir de l'intersection entre le colonial et le national. Et tout cela fonctionne de manière très subtile dans ce texte qui à la fois invente une nouvelle langue arabe et en même temps un nouveau genre. Ça, c'est le premier aspect. Le deuxième aspect, il est en lien avec l'oralité comme trace. C'est-à-dire, les romanciers arabes essayent, de langue française cette fois-ci aussi, essayent de mettre le palimpseste de leur langue maternelle dans la structure grammaticale de la langue française. Je vais prendre quelqu'un de problématique. J'aime bien voir un peu les apories des écrivains, comment un écrivain est catalogué comme ethnographique, alors qu'au fait, il peut être révolutionnaire. Ahmed Sfraoui, dans notre histoire littéraire, est considéré comme un auteur ethnographique. C'est quelqu'un qui imite le genre occidental. Quand on le lit de très près, on trouve que c'est quelqu'un de subversif. Moi, je le lis comme un écrivain subversif. Là encore, il est né dans la lecture du roman colonial, c'est-à-dire dans l'invisibilité des personnages indigènes. Or, dans La boîte à merveilles, son roman La boîte à merveilles, c'est une petite boîte dans laquelle un jeune enfant passe son temps à mettre des peut-être des petits jeux, des petits jouets pour s'amuser. Il n'est pas question de colon ici. Dans son roman, il y a une absence totale du colon. C'est-à-dire, si l'indigène est le subalterne du colon, le colon devient le subalterne de l'indigène dans ce roman. Ce sont les rôles qui s'inversent, et ils ne s'inversent pas pour que l'un prenne la place de l'autre. Ils s'inversent pour justement dire qu'il y a une autre possibilité d'occuper une position qui vient de l'intérieur même de la culture, tout en écrivant dans un genre qui vient de l'extérieur de la culture. Là, je me situe dans la question de l'ambivalence. C'est quelque chose de très intéressant dans les sociétés arabes, la notion d'ambivalence. La notion d'ambivalence est intéressante parce que souvent il est considéré comme négative. Or, dans les sociétés arabes, elle est productive dans le sens où il y a à la fois une attirance vers la modernité, genre romanesque, mais il y a en même temps un désir d'ancrage dans l'histoire traditionnelle, donc dans la tradition. Il y a en permanence un va-et-vient entre ce que Deleuze appelle la différence et la répétition. La différence, c'est ce qui renouvelle la société, donc ce qui va vers l'avenir, donc d'une certaine manière vers une autre tradition, vers une autre modernité que celle tracée par l'Occident. Et puis la répétition, c'est la tradition. La tradition, elle est marquée par la répétition en permanence. Et justement, différence et répétition, c'est l'espace de tension dans le roman maghrébin et arabe en général. Et voilà comment on peut entendre, très bien, ce sont des romans dans lesquels on entend la voix. Ce sont des romans qui ne sont pas seulement dans l'écriture, mais qui sont aussi dans la vocalité, dans l'écoute. C'est là où l'idée de oraliture me semble intéressante. L'oraliture, c'est à la fois l'oral et la littérature. C'est un terme qui me semble plus intéressant que la littérature orale, puisqu'il y a une imbrication entre ce qui est oral et ce qui est écrit littérairement. Et le mot oraliture, c'est un mot qu'on trouve chez Paul Zumthor, un spécialiste du Moyen-Âge, et ce n'est pas quelque chose de spécifique à la littérature arabe, mais la littérature arabe en fait un usage très particulier. Donc je reviens à mon palimpseste de la langue maternelle. Voilà ce qu'on lit dans un roman, c'est plutôt un recueil de nouvelles qui s'appelle Le Chapelet d'ambre de Sofréou. Ô toi qui n'as pas besoin de notre pauvreté pour augmenter tes richesses, ne nous châtie pas pour l'indignité de nos actions. Ou toi qui n'as pas besoin de notre pauvreté. Ici, le personnage s'adresse à Dieu, et il s'adresse à Dieu dans le dialecte marocain, mais qui est traduit en français. Et on voit la traduction de l'interpellation par « ô toi qui », etc. Donc ici, nous avons une trace de l'oralité de la langue maternelle dans le texte écrit. Nous avons également une autre trace d'oralité, et cette fois-ci en lien avec les Mille et une nuits. Hamoucha, raconte-moi une histoire qui fait pleurer. Le narrateur demande à ce qu'on lui raconte une histoire qui fait pleurer. Ça rappelle de manière indirecte la phrase de Shahrazad, évidemment dans les Mille et une nuits, raconter, c'est vivre, raconte ou je te tue. Alors il y a une interpellation de la narration de raconter. Et puis, on poursuit le dialogue. Que pourrais-je te raconter? Je sais tant de belles aventures, je raconterai pendant des jours, je raconterai pendant des nuits, sans épuiser ma mémoire. Raconterai pendant des jours, raconterai pendant des nuits, c'est encore les Mille et une nuits avec ce récit d'enchâssement qui se répète constamment. Et puis, vous avez également, de manière très claire cette fois-ci, la traduction du dialecte marocain dans la langue française, mais là, dans un autre roman, j'avais parlé au début du Chapelet d'ambre, maintenant c'est la boîte à merveille. Que ta journée soit ensoleillée, Lalla. En marocain, on dit que ta journée soit ensoleillée. Lalla dit, ma mère, toute remuée, le miel et le beurre coulent de ta bouche. Le miel et la bouche, en français on ne dit pas ça. Mais dans le dialecte marocain, on dit, parce qu'en français quand vous dites à quelqu'un tu es mielleux, c'est négatif. C'est négatif, ce n'est pas positif, c'est très négatif. Alors qu'ici c'est plutôt positif. Il y a un travail de subversion de la langue française et de sa syntaxe. Et dernière citation, ça va être ma conclusion. Dieu écarte de notre chemin, de celui de nos enfants et des enfants de nos enfants, tous les fils du péché qui se présentent, le sourire aux lèvres et la poitrine pleine de ténèbres. Là encore, c'est du franc-arabe, si vous voulez. Ce n'est pas du français, c'est de l'arabe francisé. Alors évidemment, Dieu écarte de notre chemin celui de nos enfants et des enfants de nos enfants. Ouladna, oulad, ouladna. Et puis après, cet Abdelkader, on dit Had Abdelkader, ce fils d'adultère, Ould al-Haram. Donc vous voyez, il y a un travail de traduction du palimpseste de la langue maternelle dans la langue d'écriture. Cette littérature, elle résiste à sa manière et elle fait de la politique à sa manière, mais avec le langage propre à la littérature, la réinvention des formes et l'introduction de thématiques que la littérature coloniale n'a pas voulu introduire dans sa propre sphère narrative. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Khalid. Let's see if I can read by handwriting. Please do help if I miss something. So Khalid's presentation is really about the question of the use of orality in the Arabic novel in general, and particularly in the Moroccan, the Maghrebi case. And he's got 3 case studies looking at early 20th century Egyptian writer Al-Muwaylihi, and then looking at a Tunisian one, Al-Mas'adi, who I think wrote his books in the 1960s, 70s. And then looking at the Moroccan Safrawi, who wrote his first novel in 1954. So the main gist of his paper is how Arab writers confronted the question of how to write a novel that is an imported genre from Europe, from France, in a very localized or local form, by reusing the tradition, how not to mimic the other, how not to use the same format or the same themes as the European novel that comes from France or Europe. And here, his argument is the use of orality, the use of oral literature as a way to overcome this conundrum for Arab writers. And his first case is the genre of maqama, which is a particular genre that emerged in medieval Arabic with Al-Hariri and Al-Hamadani. This particular genre uses the idea of writing of essays which narrate particular stories and reflections on subjects that are related to the narrator himself, and how Arab authors try to and how the use of history orally, how the genre of maqama kind of historicize particular themes or issues in a particular way. And so how Muwaylihi, who is kind of represented in Arab literature discourse about the idea of beginning of the Arabic novel as one of the first authors to write an Arabic novel. But the question of beginning is not something that concerns Khalid here, because he thinks that Arab authors are beyond that questions. So how Muwaylihi, when he wrote his first novel in early 20th century Egypt called Hadith Isa ibn Hisham, which basically can be translated quite in an ugly way as the narrative of Isa ibn Hisham. It was published in 1924. He really reused the idea of, he used two aspects of the genre of maqama. First of all, the idea of the transmission of the Prophet's saying, which is a long tradition in Arabic jurisprudence, the idea of isnad, which is the transference of the Prophet's hadith, the Prophet Muhammad hadith. So there is a long tradition that I'll say briefly about it, that for the Prophet's sayings and practices to be accepted by the Islamic Ummah, they have to have a very strong form of transference from one person to the other. And it's really important to get that right. And if it's not right, it's called a weak saying. And if it's strong, it's a strong saying. And many jurists use the idea of isnad to prove, to come up with religious decrees. So the idea of isnad isnad is quite important there in the sense that it's a reuse of Islamic tradition in that particular form. The idea of transferring knowledge, transferring historicity through that particular genre of the maqama that Muwaylihi really worked on. And from the point of view of the use of Arabic cultural heritage, how to transfer Arabic cultural heritage in a foreign form, in the genre of the novel. So the gist of the argument here is that it's the reinventing or the appropriating of the genre of the novel, which I think is something very common in South Asia, through the use of one's cultural heritage. And so the idea is that Al-Muwaylihi tried to inscribe himself in a long tradition, or in tradition of a long narrative traditions of the cosmopolitan Arabic literary tradition. So he kind of positioned himself there while using a foreign genre, which is the novel. So it's kind of negotiating a new genre while using Arabic literary heritage. And then the second example is the case of Mahmoud al-Mas'adi, who is one of the best known intellectuals slash novelists in Tunisia and the Maghreb. Here, Khalid talked about a particular text. So instead of, remember when he said Hadith Isa ibn Hisham, which is the narrative of Isa ibn Hisham, al-Mas'adi kind of twisted and he said, Haddathana Abu Huraira. So in a sense, Abu Huraira said, so he's kind of using the passive hadith. He said Haddathana, the active voice there, which is kind of taking charge, kind of the act of appropriating. And Abu Huraira is a very famous jurist, in a sense, or transferer of the tradition of the Prophet saying. So in the history of Isnad itself, this idea of transferring the Prophet saying, once you see the name of Abu Huraira, and Abi Huraira, from Abu Huraira, then you know that it's a strong one, it's correct. So it's kind of a reliable narrator in a sense, that act of transferring tradition. So al-Mas'adi here really appropriate this tradition, the Islamic tradition. But before I forget this point, which I think is very important that Khalid made, it doesn't mean that al-Mas'adi here had a very passive relationship to the Islamic cultural heritage. In a way, he was critical of that, as well as critical of the colonial institutions. So he positioned himself between the two. So he appropriated tradition while criticizing or decolonizing the act of writing itself, trying to decolonize it. And so in a way, his narrative is in dialogue with the writings on the Maghreb, the colonial writing on the Maghreb, particularly the case of Pierre Loti and the others, who produced very ethnographic, very orientalizing narrative on Maghrebi societies. So in a sense, al-Mas'adi positioned himself between the two. While he criticized these writings, the colonial writing on the Maghreb, he also reappropriated tradition, but he also is critical of that tradition. It's not sacralized. It's in a way also appropriated in a particular way, in a critical way. So in that sense, the novel genre, as Khalid argued, creates this tension between various forms, in a sense, tradition, modernity, how to appropriate tradition while being critical of it, but also how to decolonize the act of writing. So this tension is a kind of genre that is quite, that kind of, the novel in the Maghreb kind of lives on and produces. And he quoted from al-Mas'adi's novel, Haddathana Abu Huraira, and he pointed out 3 points. Abu Huraira as a religious figure, but Abu Huraira as linguist, but also Abu Huraira as a narrator. And so what al-Mas'adi did in this text is to try to appropriate Abu Huraira as a narrator by bringing the intersection of the colonial and the post-colonial, in a sense, tradition, but also modernity, reinvention of the genre of the novel by appropriating one's cultural heritage. Now, a third point that he's trying to make is the idea of orality as a trace that is found in Maghrebi texts. And that's a very important point. He calls it oralité, or oral literature in a sense. So in a sense, is how orality becomes a written form, how it's transformed into written forms, and that's quite unique to Maghrebi writers because it's mainly linked to the question of language, because they are writing in a foreign language, in a sense, in a foreign language. The language of the ex-colonizer is in French, and so how do you transform? In a sense, how do you write in a language that is not yours, in a sense that is foreign, but you make it your own? And that's why orality, in a sense, transfer or Moroccanize or Arabize French. So he looked at the work of Ahmed Safrawi, who is one of the early Francophone writers in Morocco. And Safrawi's works were not very well received by Moroccan critics at the time, and even today. He's always accused of orientalizing Morocco, representing the Moroccan society in a very exotic way. The accusation is that he's writing for a French audience who wants to know about what Moroccan inner household are doing, like the preparation of the food, the tea, the harim, the inside of the house. But in fact, Khalid is presenting a new reading of that. He's saying he doesn't necessarily see it that way. He sees Safrawi as appropriating the notion of Moroccan, the vernacular Moroccan language, the Darija, the spoken Moroccan, and introduce it in French. That sensitivity, the sensitivity of the maternal tongue, the language, into writing. And so in that sense, he gave us many examples about, for example, the way Moroccans use certain expressions, like something like you're like honey, that is not accepted in French, but he kind of French Moroccanizes French. So in that sense, he in a sense disorients the French reader, who does not see French as his language or her language anymore, because it's a different French, a different kind of French that seems very unfamiliar to them, to the French themselves. So in a sense, it's the idea of taking the French readers out of their own comfort zone and introduce them to another form of orality, another form of writing, by translating from Moroccan dialect or writing French in a very Moroccan way, which gives the Maghrebi or Moroccan novel a particular sensitivity, a particular aesthetic that belongs to that. So in that sense, to sum up, Maghrebi and Arab writers adopted the form or the genre of the novel, but transformed it, appropriated in a different way by introducing new forms and new themes.
The Moroccan narrator and person is visible in the novel.
And the Moroccan narrator and the writer is very visible through the writing of the novel. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have, I think, to be fair to the speakers, half an hour of questions. Yeah, we can go a bit over time, like 5 minutes, if that is allowed. Apovaran, is Apovaran here to tell us whether we are allowed? We are allowed. We'll see how it goes if we have questions. Right, so can I take questions from the audience, please? Who wants to start? Yes, please.
3 सवाल है मेरे पास। प्रोफेसर साधना मैं आपसे ये जानना चाहता हूँ कि मिर्ज़ापुर में जब ये लोग काम कर रहे थे तो क्या मिर्ज़ापुर की कजलियों का भी संग्रह किया या सिर्फ लोक कथाओं में ही दिलचस्पी रही? और बद्री नारायण, आपसे सवाल है कि जैसे जिस गीत का आपने उदाहरण दिया उसमें एक लाइन आती है कि न रेल बैरी है पैसवा बैरी है जो पिया को लेके जा रही है, तो आखिर क्या ऐसी वजह हुई कि भोजपुरी इलाके के लोग बार बार कलकत्ता जा रहे हैं और क्यों अपने घर को छोड़ के जाना पड़ रहा है? और एक बात और कि परदेश का वैसे तो संस्कृत में भी और बाकी जगहों पर भी, लेकिन अगर हम अमीर खुसरो को याद करें, उनकी प्रसिद्ध कव्वाली है जिसमें एक पंक्ति आती है कि तू सम में सो जा चुजर रहा जो मेहरे आप अगस्ती माखिर, न नींद नैना न अंग चैना, न आप आवे न भेज पतियां। तो इसको भी कैसे देखें? और पता नहीं खालिद साहब से ये सवाल जुड़ेगा कि नहीं जुड़ेगा, लेकिन मैं जो उपन्यास के बारे में सुन रहा तो मेरे मन में एक बात आई, भारत में इसमें बहुत बहस है कि भारतीय उपन्यास की अवधारणा है या नहीं है। तो क्या अरब में भी इस तरह की कोई बात है कि अरब उपन्यास यानी यूरोप से अलग किस्म का कोई उपन्यास अरबी में विकसित हुआ हो? शुक्रिया.
Okay, so the first question to Sadna was whether he was interested only in folk tales, but or also in the local song genre of Kajlis. The second to Badrina Rain, but maybe the others want. So the first question was why are they so the songs, the Videsia songs, why, and in Bhojpur, why is there this hatred of the railway and going to Calcutta? And the other was, what about the earlier examples of travel to, or songs that talk about this migrant experience, as in Amir Khusro's Qawwali from the, Qawwali attributed to Amir Khusro. And the question to Khalid is whether, in India there's been a lot of, a question by Yogesh to you, there's been a lot of debate on whether there is there was an Indian form of the novel, or whether or it developed an Indian form of the novel, and whether there was such a debate within Arabic as well. Yes.
Yeah, I'll take more questions. We take more questions, and then Basma, please.
A question for Sadhna. Sadhna, is there any hint of resentment even in Ramgarib Chowdhury's writings about the relationship to Crook and where he stands? Or is it something that he just willingly participates in? So that's my question. For Badrina Rai, these genres, they are current only in Bihar and Bhojpur, or are they also available in Mauritius, Suriname, and so on?
A follow-up question for Sadhna. A very interesting comparison that I think really takes us outside of the Saidian model of knowledge production in terms of understanding this relationship. My question is, I guess, you seem to present two different ways of thinking about it. The first is one rooted in, well, not rooted in, one with elements of mutual respect that perhaps is connected to this colonial disjuncture you mentioned. And then the other is this, this deep critique of the vizier. So my question is, do you see these as in tension, or are they sort of overlapping? Thank you.
Itzia, and then
Francesca and Ravikant. Ravikant also.
We'll answer after Itzia. We'll answer the first set of questions, and then because otherwise they won't remember all.
Okay.
And then we go to the second set. Itzia, please.
Thank you. So thank you very much, the three of you. I really enjoyed the panel. I wanted to make some comments. I wanted to thank Badri. I really like the sort of going beyond this binary between emotion and curse, which is pretty much gendered as well. And also, I found very persuasive your argument about the consideration that weeping is not a weapon of the weak, but actually it's a powerful means of expression and of curse. And also, I also appreciated the recitation that you made, and the point about the collective literary construction. So thank you very much. I wanted to, also on Khalid's paper, I very much appreciated your reading of Safrawi as being subversive, and I was wondering if that can inspire us to sort of not make this emphasis on French being foreign, or of the novel being French and European, but of speaking of Moroccan French and of these new products, linguistic, with in the case of Moroccan French, or literary as the novel. It's a bit related to the previous question. And I had a question as well, I mean a comment and a question to Shadna. I really liked your paper, and I wanted to ask you if you could develop a little bit more how you conceptualize the colonial disjunctions. In my PhD dissertation, I found, I talked about mimesis between the Spanish and the Moroccans, because I found an idea that is linked to that notion that you were putting forth of like mutual mimicking, if we like, that has been sort of being more emphasized in a unidirectional way, and which I did see the bidirectionality. Yeah, I found the Spaniards being really impressed and also self-identifying with Moroccans and ventriloquizing their discourses, and so I could see this this sort of mutual impact and influence that you were pointing. So I would love to hear a bit more about how you conceptualize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Etienne. So we ask this speakers to answer this set of questions. We take this like a step. So now we will please start, and then Badar and Ashkan.
Well, I think I'll go backwards, and I'll begin by answering your question here, and आपके question पे मैं बाद में आती हूँ, उसका reason बताऊँगी. Regarding your question about colonial disjunctions, my work on colonialism and folklore collection in India was followed by my study of folklore collections from all across the British Empire, because I felt that whole post-colonial theory is still located in nationalist context, which is problematic because empire was an international project. So this is a book called The Story Time of the British Empire, in which I theorize upon that. So I would may I refer you to that, because it will be a long answer to this question otherwise. Then I'll take Vasudha's question and James's question together, whether one sees resentment in Chaube's writing, and how to understand this mutual respect on one side and the Wazir's story which he inserts on the other side. I think for this, one important fact is, it's a big story as I said, but one important fact is that when he joins Crook, he is not aware that he is not going to be acknowledged for his work. This appears about 3-4 years later, when Crook's most famous work called Popular Religion and Folklore of India appears 2 years later, the first volume, and then the second volume. And Chaube is in his life, but there's not a single mention of the man. So in the beginning, he was not aware when he engages with this with such intensity. On the other hand, if you see his letter, and I mean, he narrates multiple incidents. Crook was not a regular civil servant who spent his time in Gymkhana Club. So the way he treats Chaube, I mean, he kind of just sends away his colleagues and others if Chaube comes into the room, and so there is personally, Crook is very, very respectful and very collegial to Chaube. It's kind of I don't know how many examples are there of a relationship like that. This is not only seen by Crook's Chaube's letter, but I also found and met with Crook's grandsons, who were themselves 75 plus years of age, and his wife was much younger to them, and she lived on later, and so the grandsons had a whole narrative about William Crook from his wife. And that, again, was a very different narrative, how distanced he was from his family. I mean, if you contrast their narratives with Chaube's, it is yet another surprising factor. To his family, he was like really somebody very, very distanced. I mean, like his 3 sons were in the First World War, and they wrote some 275 letters from the war fronts, and not a single one is addressed to the father, all to the mother only. So they all had this. So he's kind of just lost in this Indian scenario, etc. So so that complexity of relationship between Chaube and Crook does not. There's a realization. His one and main problem, and an account in Hindi says that he goes mad because of that lack of acknowledgement. That is what drives him to insanity. So that's his problem is not the way he and Crook worked, but but on the other side, I as a researcher, why Crook is not a crook for me, because the way he leaves Chaube's signed manuscripts, Crook after such an eventful life has 60 boxes of personal papers in Royal Anthropological Institute's archive, and he archives just one letter, one single letter, and that's Chaube's letter. It's like he was leaving traces. Maybe his time did not permit him. Now Chaube is as a co-author, and that's what exactly he was. But he leaves the finest, part of this collection, and it's like science was spread across these two continents. India and I don't know how many trips are from Gorakhpur to London to other places. Crook's perception of Chaube is also very, very complex, and he has not articulated it himself. He has left science to this thing. अब मैं आपके सवाल को I'll answer both in Hindi and in English. आपके सवाल मैं सबसे बाद में इसलिए ले रही हूँ क्योंकि ये सबसे ज़्यादा फ्यूचरिस्टिक सवाल है, सबसे ज़्यादा आगे का सवाल है. सही बात है, चौबे और क्रूक ने सिर्फ कथाएं नहीं कलेक्ट करी थी, सॉन्ग्स भी करे थे, कजली भी करी थी, और वो मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट्स कहाँ थी अभी तक पता नहीं था. लेकिन मुझे अभी बहुत ही 2 महीने पहले ही ये चीज़ पता चली है. मैं अभी इसके बारे में इससे ज़्यादा नहीं कह सकती, लेकिन ये मेरा अगला काम है. He asked me whether they only collected the folk tales or also the folk songs. I knew there were several references that they collected folk songs, including Kajli, the genre you mentioned, but we did not, the manuscripts were not to be traced. I have just gotten to know of them some 2 months ago. I can't say more right now, but that's going to be my next, I'll return to Chaube again after 10-15 years, and looking forward very much to that.
Yeah. Thanks for these questions. Criticism of the money. Yeah, you are very right. Actually, Hindi mein, this song, first of all recorded by Naresh Tripathi in 1930, and he wrote that when I was on the Jaunpur station, and one group of women came to see off their husband, and they were singing this song and crying, singing and crying. So it's very interesting to understand this relationship of singing and crying together. So and money is a widely criticized in Bhojpuri. Lot of curse for the money, because money means currency. When currency came, those who had a barter system, they were self-sufficient. They were living a better life that time. When the currency came, the sense of deprivation and the poverty and the meaning of poverty, they all came because of money. And because of money, husband started migrating because that barter system was not sufficient like that for that time. So lot of this Relia na Bairi, Jahajiya na Bairi se Paisava Bairina, Morsaya ke Bilmavere Paisava Bairina. And Paisa is I wrote a paper in IIC Kocherli about criticism of money, how they criticize money. So that's about this Amir Khushro and all. You are very right. Actually, this experience of going to another world, एक देश छोड़ के दूसरे देश में जाना, दूसरे लोक में जाना, death, the kind of transcendence. There are various kinds of saintly experience we are told in social metaphors, because migration is an ongoing metaphor, and every time it's happening. Even in ancient society, migration, society made because of migration. So even saints, we are looking, understanding this metaphor of migration. That's why another world, notion of another world is there. And Amir Khushro, Kabir, so many Bhakti poets use this An Muluk and this Videsh, and then Videsh has different meaning, as I suggested. About this genre, Ripotwa are also in Suriname and Mauritius and other countries. Actually, for me, it's not only genre, it's it's experience. And experience, if someone knows that someone is crying because of that person, so they also start crying. Because this is it's a creative recording of the cry because of the family who were deserted here, and because of the guilt of leaving them there with their family. That kind of cry you can find recorded in both locations, and that's why this Sawal Jawab form in the same meter, but with another change context, in a different context. So that's these errors are there. About your comments, I would like to tell a few things about these comments. It's wonderfully you took this argument. Actually, always in our poetry, also in literature, always we see a downgrade emotion. We say this criticism means rationality and modernity relationship. So always we glorify rationality, and emotions, cry, curse is considered to be feminine thing. It's a lower kind of expressions, and that's why in Ashokji's here, for longer time this emotion is not well accepted in a better way even in Hindi poetry. When we came in the poetry scene in 90s, and we came with a kind of emotional expression of poems and poets of daily, those who were very much for rationalist kind of rationality poetry, they criticize. So emotion issue is not only for oral, but from oral we can learn that, and we can understand the vibrancy and the power and the strength of this criticism, form of criticism.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I'm really so happy to be in Delhi because I discovered the theoretical debate, and I discovered too new literature for me, Indian literature. I think we have the same questions, and nous avons les mêmes problèmes, nous avons les mêmes questions. For example, for the first question, debate about form of novel. Between Arabophone writers, we have one deep debate, but between Francophone writers, we have not a good debate. Debate is in Paris between Francophone writers. Et je pense que le problème de la forme, il remonte au 19e siècle. C'est-à-dire que les écrivains de langue arabe, depuis le 19e siècle, avaient déjà entamé un débat sur la forme du roman à travers les revues. Beaucoup de revues, dans l'histoire de la littérature arabe, les revues ont joué un rôle primordial, un rôle très important. Et depuis la fin du 19e siècle, il y avait des débats très intéressants sur comment écrire le roman, est-ce qu'on écrit le roman comme le monde occidental ou non, et ce débat se prolonge jusqu'aux années 70-80. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui le débat change un petit peu, mais entre les francophones, le débat sur la forme du roman se fait très rarement. Il se fait très rarement, par contre, il y a des réflexions francophones, notamment d'un écrivain comme Abdelkbir Khatibi, sur l'écriture de la forme du roman, des réflexions aussi, mais de manière différente, chez Kilito, tu en as parlé hier, il y a des réflexions sur le roman, et le problème qui se pose, c'est est-ce qu'on doit imiter le roman occidental ou on doit inventer une nouvelle forme? À vrai dire, moi je pense que c'est une question qui n'est pas très intéressante. Est-ce qu'on doit inventer ou non? C'est-à-dire l'écrivain, il invente nécessairement une nouvelle forme. Donc on ne peut pas avoir comme projet d'écriture l'invention d'une nouvelle forme. Mais ça se fait de manière, je dirais, historique. Parce que le mot naturel est très idéologique, je dirais de manière historique. Et ça se fait comment? Une génération essaie de dépasser une autre génération, essaie de remettre en question ce qui lui a été transmis, et on revient à la question de l'auteur, the author. L'auteur, ce n'est pas un état civil, c'est une filiation textuelle. C'est une fonction, comme dirait Michel Foucault. Donc l'auteur est une fonction. L'auteur est une accumulation de textes. Et l'accumulation de textes donne des formes littéraires. Et c'est vrai que dans les pays du Maghreb, on peut parler plus de récits que de romans. Pourquoi? Parce que le récit, c'est un universel linguistique. C'est-à-dire, dans toutes les cultures, il y a le récit. C'est pour ça que je pense, ça c'est une hypothèse sur laquelle je continue de travailler, le roman maghrébin surtout, est un récit anthropologique. Ah, ça va scandaliser les littéraires, mais quel est le lien entre le roman et l'anthropologie? C'est le récit, justement. C'est le récit.
Je vais traduire ce que j'ai dit, et puis tu peux répondre rapidement. D'accord. So Khalid was saying that the debate about the form of the novel has taken place in the Middle East through literary journals. There was a heated debate for quite a long time through this literary journal that actually were connecting the entirety of the Arab world about the genre of the novel, the form, the aesthetics, and how it could be appropriated and changed. But for the Francophone side, it was mainly the debate was in France between the Francophone authors, but there was a discussion in Morocco by the well-known bilingual author Abdelkabir Khatibi, who is also a critic, and he theorized a lot about the idea of the novel and the genre of the novel, and how to write a kind of a localized form of the novel. And I think it's through the idea of form and language. And Khalid is suggesting that he thinks of the novel through the idea of the essay, because it represents more the literary traditions in the region, the idea of writing. And he also said something very provocative that many critics would have liked, that it's an essay, anthropological essay, which I think he needs to unpack for us later, because I think that's quite an interesting idea. But Abu Varan just suggested that Khalid will answer the second question that Itzia asked, and then we'll take Udaya, Rusinka, and Francesca's question, and your question as well, at discussion comparisons time.
Yeah,
Do you mind,
sure.
please?
No.
Would that be acceptable? If there can be more questions to be fed to our speakers at 5:15. But I'll just allow Khalid to answer the second question.
Très rapidement, c'est vrai qu'il y a un français littéraire maghrébin. Ce n'est pas la règle générale, mais il existe. Et il y a un vocabulaire maghrébin francisé. C'est-à-dire, par exemple, sur la structure lexicale, on trouve un mot arabe, mais qui est dans la structure lexicale française. Je prends un exemple de la littérature algérienne. Les jeunes qui se mettent tout le temps à dos, ils se mettent contre un dos, ils attendent, ils sont des chômeurs, ils ne font rien. On les appelle les hitistes. C'est-à-dire, le hit, c'est le mur. Les gens qui se mettent au mur. Donc il y a beaucoup de mots comme ça. On traduit des expressions idiomatiques, bon, ça existe. Mais il y a, en fait, il n'y a pas une appropriation de la langue française. C'est-à-dire, la langue française reste encore dans l'espace littéraire, et ce que les écrivains expérimentent dans la littérature, ce n'est pas forcément ce qui se passe dans la vie sociale de tous les jours. Il y a dans la société une pidginisation du français. Et dans la littérature, il y a une traduction de la langue maternelle dans le français. Par exemple, il y a le code switching dans la société, mais dans la littérature, on ne trouve pas toujours ce code switching qui domine la société.
So the idea of the question was about the idea of appropriating French and making it a local language, like one of the local languages in the Maghreb. So Khalid was saying that it's happening on the level of the use of words and the invention of words, like the word hitist, which means the unemployed youth in the Maghreb who would stand against the war. It's a kind of a term used, it's an expression used to talk about the unemployed. They're called the hitis, or those who maintain walls, because they have nothing else to do. So that's an expression that is now widely used in the French language. And also various other expressions, like inshallah now is very common in France. And various other words, I think le bled and one. But he doesn't think that the level of appropriation is happening on the academic level of the language. That's what he was saying, which I disagree with. But I'll exploring that in the afternoon discussion because we don't have the time right now. Thank you so much for our speakers, and I'm sorry that we didn't finish the questions.
आपका PowerPoint है रविकांत लगा दे Hello.
Panel 5 on multilingualism and the technologies of print and radio. Our first presenter is Itzea on Hispano-Moroccan literature in colonial Morocco, the case of the bilingual journals Al-Multamid and Katama.
Yes, thank you very much. First I should say that this is the first elaboration of a preliminary stage of a new investigation on Moroccan literature in the last stage of the Spanish protectorate in northern Morocco. I have worked on Spanish colonialism in Morocco, but in the 19th century, so when colonial rule was yet to be established, but where colonial relations and dynamics were already starting to take place and shape. So instead of the two bilingual journals that I thought I would be able to present my work on today, I will just concentrate on one of the literary journals. So first I will offer a contextualization of the geographic and the time locations that I will be talking about. I will also talk about the significant geographies that this literary journal called Katama allows us to trace, and of practices of translation, and I will end up hopefully doing an exercise of reading together, as Karima proposes, of some stories. So my main argument is that Moroccan colonial literature, at least as it emerged in Tétouan in the 1950s, is to be understood as the result of the intersection of the local and the international, or the translocal, we could also call it, conceptions, socio-political discourses, and literary tastes and tropes of the written and the oral literary genre and the different languages. So, it's not working. Well, anyways. So the Spanish and the larger European colonial penetration into Morocco was consolidated via treaties and the presence of several institutions throughout the second half of the 19th century.